Thank you all very much for being here. This is a particularly important book talk, and I want to thank Alma, Gildenhorn, and others who helped, Joe, if you were around, to help sponsor. Thank you. Your daughter, all the people, thank you for doing this. This is a particularly important book talk because this is the most important book you could possibly read this year. In fact, it may be the most important book you'll read this decade because the growing economic opportunity gap is the biggest political and moral and economic issue of our time. I want to make sure everybody afterwards gets a book from Politics and Prose, which Professor Putnam will sign. But then I want you to buy another book and give it to the most influential political person you know and test them on it and make sure they read it, and then tell 5 other people to buy copies of this book. Because this book could help transform our political debate in an exceedingly important way. Professor Robert Putnam is a Malkin Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University, but you're a lot more than that, although heaven knows it's hard to be a lot more than that. But he is a poet laureate, as my friend Jason DePaul said, of civic discourse and civil society. He's also a rock star when it comes to Harvard professors, which is saying a lot, given the fact that all Harvard professors aspire to be rock stars.
I won't be able to go back there now.
That's right. Michael Sandel will never allow you back, our other great moral rock star from Harvard. So I want to begin by just asking you, everybody knows you wrote Bowling Alone, which is about the civic capital a society has. Tell us about this book and why you wrote it.
Well, thanks very much, Walter, for inviting me here to have a chance to talk with all of you, and thanks very much for coming. I feel really passionately about this book because it describes what the consequences for our kids are of some of the big trends that we're aware of in general in America. We've become a more economically polarized country, we all know that. Less well known as it were a socially segregated, more socially segregated society. We're less likely to live near people or go to school with people or marry people from a different social class than we were a generation ago. So we've become a more socially polarized place, a more economically polarized place. There'll be some other big changes. And I wanted to look at what are the implications for those changes for our kids, for children in America. And the more we looked, the more horrified, frankly, we were by what we found, because what we found was growing gaps between what in this book we call rich kids and poor kids on many, many measures of child well-being. But by rich kids and poor kids, I don't mean Bill Gates's kids or Warren Buffett's kids and some homeless family. I mean the upper part of the American socioeconomic hierarchy that I'm talking about are just people who are college graduates or their children. Can I see the hands of all the people in the room who are college graduates, please? So when I say rich, I mean you. So I don't mean rich. I just mean you're in the upper third. By having a college degree, you're in the upper third of American society. And the lower third are people who have not got past high school. And that's, you can see a gap between kids coming from college-educated backgrounds and high school-educated backgrounds, a growing gap on many, many measures of child well-being. How much money their parents spend on them, how much time the parents spend with them, what we call good night moon time, the quality of schools they go to, the stability of their families, big difference, but growing gap between rich kids and poor kids and the stability of families, growing gap too in the support that they get from neighbors and churches and community institutions. And that's the connection with my earlier work on Bowling Alone, because now I can see more clearly than I did when I wrote Bowling Alone that the ultimate victims of this increasing individualism of American society are our kids. Or rather, I now see that what I described in Bowling Alone meant that when we use the word "our kids," we now have a more shriveled sense of what counts as our kids. When I was growing up in Ohio in the 1950s, and people used the term, we got to do things for our kids. Well, my parents said we got to pay higher taxes so our kids will have a swimming pool or a French department or whatever. They did not mean my sister and me. They meant all the kids in town. But if you go back to Port Clinton nowadays and talk to people, when they say our kids, they mean my biological kids. And poor kids in town now are seeing, well, she's not my kid, she's somebody else's kid, let them worry about her. That's the way in which the trends in Bowling Alone, the focus on more individualism and less shared responsibility, that's the way those trends come to bear on kids.
Your book is a combination of stories and facts, right? Socioeconomic analysis on the one hand, but real people, real kids.
Right.
And it starts, as you just said, in Port Clinton, Ohio, 1959, I think, when you graduate. I don't mean to give away your age.
No, why not? I'm 74.
That's right.
And proud of it.
What were the stories of the people from your class in Port Clinton versus the stories that happen now?
Well, I always have to begin by saying Port Clinton in the 1950s, America in the 1950s, was not an ideal place. There was lots of injustice and inequality, and that was true especially for the few black kids in town, and of course women in that era faced a glass ceiling as soon as they got out of high school. So there was gender and racial inequality, but in class terms, it was a remarkably egalitarian time and place, and that's not just seeing the past through gold-colored lenses. We went back and talked to and interviewed basically all of my surviving high school classmates of the class of 1959. Port Clinton was a very modest town when I was growing up there. Nobody very rich, nobody very poor. Almost half of the parents of my kids in my graduating class had not graduated from high school, so this is a pretty, not backward, but a pretty modest place. But of my classmates, almost 80% of us did better than our parents in education and income and so on. We had a remarkable upward climb. As many of my classmates said when we talked to them, we were poor, but we didn't know it. But actually, in fact, we were immensely rich, and we didn't know it, because we were rich in social support from our parents and from the community and so on. And there were two black kids in my graduating class. They faced serious racism in Port Clinton. There were cross burnings and so on that are described in the book. And nevertheless, and they came from homes in which nobody had gotten past third grade. Nobody in their family had ever gotten past third grade. They both graduated from high school. Big deal, big upward mobility from third grade to high school degree in one generation. They both went to college. They both graduated from college.
They went to college because they had mentors in the community.
Exactly right. They had, and actually, white mentors in the community. In the case of the black guy, I guess in the book we call him Jesse. These are names, I know them in real life, so I have to pause and not give the name away. But Jesse, white coach, as he says very gently in the book, the white coach may have actually been kind of racist, but he held Jesse to high standards and expected Jesse to do well. No tyranny of low expectations there on the football field, and helped Jesse to get a college football scholarship. Even more striking was the woman we call Cheryl. She's had a terrific life, and she's really smart. She was one of the smartest kids in the class. But she's aware, deeply aware, even now, of the price she paid because of the color of her skin. But the most remarkable turning point in her life was when one of the wife of one of the CEOs in town, for whom Cheryl cleaned, was recognized that Cheryl was a hard worker and that she was smart, and this woman recognized that, asked Cheryl one day, "Are you going to college?" And Cheryl said, "No, nobody in my family can't imagine my going to college." And the matron said, "Well, surely the school's going to make you go to college or help you get to college." And Cheryl said, "No, it doesn't look like that's happening." And then I'm more or less now quoting Cheryl, and she put on her fur coat and she put on her fur hat and she marched onto the high school and she pounded on the desk and said, "This girl is smart, you better get her to college." And that's why the woman went to college.
Our kids' mentality.
Yes, exactly. Now, when we went back to Port Clinton a couple of years ago, and my ethnographic team, especially Jen Silva, who's the terrific ethnographer here in the book, began interviewing poor kids in Port Clinton now, poor white kids mostly in Port Clinton now. I honestly, at first, Walter, didn't believe. I wondered, where did she find these kids? Because they're, like Mary Sue, one of these kids who's essentially a throwaway child, and her father, neither her father nor her mother have ever been married, and there have been sort of changing partnerships going through the family, and Mary Sue was left alone for long periods of time, locked in her room, her room, and dropped out of high school, got involved in selling drugs, went to juvenile detention, hasn't got any serious skill. She goes from man to man, hoping she'll find somebody who will provide her help and protection. Just a couple of weeks ago, she told us that the guy she's with now has found a job for her as a model in Toledo. And then 2 weeks ago, she said on Facebook, she's found a solution. Her problem is that nobody in her life loves her and cares for her, so she's going to have a baby. And honestly, when I first heard that story, I thought, this can't be Port Clinton. How could this be in this little town? But it is, and there are more. What we discovered, I don't want to tell sob stories only, and there's all the data there is in the book, in these chapters, is to say this is not Putnam just making up sob stories. There, you can see what the data look like, but honestly, if you see these stories, I almost could not write some of these stories because they were so painful. And Port Clinton actually is like the rest of the country in another way now. Port Clinton, what happened to Port Clinton after I left there was basically it's a Rust Belt town, and the economy, went down, and that's why Mary Sue's parents have never held a job. But it's got a great site on Lake Erie. Port Clinton has a wonderful site on Lake Erie, and in the last 20 years, that site there's essentially one long gated community that's 20 miles long and about 150 yards deep, with million-dollar mansions.
So let's talk about that other end of the socioeconomic spectrum in the comparison from '59 to today. I think the rich kid in your class was a guy named Frank, and the rich kid today is a young girl named Chelsea.
Right. Well, Frank, I just saw Frank a couple of weeks ago, actually, because we were out doing a TV shot out there, and Frank's a wonderful guy, and this sounds a little silly. He was by far the richest kid in our class, although none of us knew that. I didn't know that actually until not long ago. His grandfather had memorably said, when you go off to New York or Cleveland even, you can drink whatever you want to drink, but if the kids are drinking Coke in Port Clinton, you drink Coke.
In other words, don't flaunt your wealth.
Exactly. And now Chelsea, what is this, 50 years later, I mean, she's flaunting her wealth, but her parents have built a 1950s style diner in their basement so that she could have kids home. Every year they have a birthday party for her, and they hire limousines so that the kids coming to the birthday party can be picked up and come to their home, their beautiful home.
But do the parents also have an our kids mentality that they care about other people's kids?
No, they don't. I mean, the mother, and Chelsea's mother actually, as we quote in the book, says she doesn't understand why her kids should have to, or her kids should have to pay for anybody else's kids. They're somebody else's kids. Let them worry about them. And that encapsulates this change. This happened in Port Clinton, and in fact, I think it's happened across the United States.
So half the book is these stories that give real flesh and blood, almost gut-wrenching meaning to your themes. The other half is socioeconomic analysis, including what are called scissors graphs. I could point them out, but why don't you tell us what the scissors graphs are and what the most shocking of those are?
Well, there are a lot of them. Scissors graphs, the horizontal axis is time. So over here we have 1960, 1970, and over here we have now. And the vertical axis is some good thing for kids, like spending time with kids or spending money on kids or whatever. And it's the scissors graph we say because over time, the graph for kids coming from high school educated homes, my grandchildren, and your children or grandchildren, are getting better and better. But on those same measures, kids coming from the lower third of America are getting worse and worse. That scissors graph, if you see what I mean by scissors graph, the gap, the opportunity gap, is the growing gap. So you can see that gap in.
Why don't you give one example so
Yeah,
people
I
can
will.
see it?
Yeah, I was just about to.
Okay.
You can see it in the amount of time parents spend reading to their kids, what we call good night moon time. There's now, didn't used to be any gap at all between any social class gap in the amount of time parents spend reading to their kids. Now there's a 45-minute a day gap. My grandchildren get 45 minutes a day more reading time than Mary Sue did. And I don't mean that literally. I'm talking about the Mary Sue's versus my own grandchildren. And if you know about modern brain science, you know that is unbelievably important because that's the way the brain develops. The infant brain develops through verbal interaction with other adults. So there are similar graphs for the amount of money we spend on kids, similar graphs for the amount of social support they get from their community, similar graphs big graphs in terms of family stability. Now more than 90% of all kids being raised in college-educated homes are being raised in two-parent families as compared to now only about 30% of kids being raised in high school educated homes are being raised in two-parent families. I'm not making a moral point about that. I'm just saying it's harder to raise kids if you have got only one parent at home. So there are big gaps also in all these other support systems that we, from schools to churches to scouts and all of those things. You can see these, even including extracurricular activities. Extracurricular activities, I kind of hyperventilate about extracurricular activities because extracurricular activities were not invented by God. High school football was not invented by God. It was invented by educational reformers to give all kids in school a chance to learn soft skills, teamwork and grit and delayed gratification and so on. But because of pay to play nationwide, now, over the last 20 years, if you want to play football in high school, the good taxpayers of Port Clinton paid for my cleats and my pads and my helmet and the Friday night lights. Now, if you want to play football in Port Clinton High School and elsewhere around the country, on average, you've got to pay $400 per kid per sport. So that's $1,600 if you've got two kids in school. If your annual income is $200,000, $1,600 for your kids to take part in sports is nothing. But if your annual income is $16,000, as a lot of American families live on, you're not going to pay 10% of your total annual salary for sports. And that means I'm trying to show how across a very wide range of indicators, kids increasingly are, their chances in life are influenced not by their own skills and abilities, but by their parents' resources. And that, for example, there's a graph in the book that I find in some sense just unbelievably disheartening in which you try to predict who's going to graduate from high school based on test scores and parents' income. Now, you're not surprised that rich kids who are smart, who have high test scores, are very likely to graduate from college. 70, 80% of them graduate from college. And poor, dumb kids, if I can put it that way, are very unlikely to graduate from college. But smart, poor kids are less likely to graduate from college now than dumb, rich kids. And that absolutely, I don't mean dumb, I mean just low test scores, right? That just is exactly the opposite of what the American dream was. It shouldn't, your chances of life shouldn't depend upon your parents, they should depend upon you.
When I first read this book, it began to cause me to see 2 or 3 times an hour sometimes examples of it. And I think you talk about that, like being on a bus and watching a mother too harried to play I Spy or things like that.
Yeah, it's, this is a problem, I think, that is worse in part because of one of the big changes that I mentioned at the outset, that is the growing segregation of American society. So it's just factually true that well-meaning folks coming from higher up in the social hierarchy, by which I mean us, well-meaning folks coming from that, are much less likely actually to know or to contact or to interact with poorer kids than we were, people like us were a couple of generations ago. And that means, I don't think unless we go looking for it, unless we're aware of what's happening, I don't think we have a sense of how bad things have gotten for people, at the lower part of the lower part of the economic hierarchy. There are important racial differences in America. But this gap is not about race, this is about social class. You can see the growing gap, only among white folks, or only among black folks. I want to be clear, there are important racial discrepancies still in America. We've not solved the racial problem, but for poor black kids, this is overlaid on that racial problem, and it's getting worse. This part is getting worse.
You talked about how there's a divergence of whether or not you're going to graduate from college, and you said, 90% if,
Right.
come from a rich and well-off family versus whatever. But I think the difference has grown over the past 40 years, like 50 percentage points almost.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the problem,
Yeah.
is that, the scissors.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, of course, it might be bad enough if you said, well, rich kids have a much better, in all these respects, have much better chances than poor kids. But this is the change. It didn't used to be that within living memory, at least within living memory of many of the people in the room, we had a much more egalitarian, in America, it was much more egalitarian. America was not, I'm not saying to say America was perfect, but in this respect, we've gotten a lot worse. And, I hate to say this because I don't like to be just a Cassandra, but if we do nothing about it, it's going to get worse. We ain't seen nothing yet unless we begin to address this problem. Think about Mary Sue's baby, right? I mean, just think about that. Yeah.
Well, the great equalizer that kept the divergence from happening and
Right.
instead allowed equal opportunity used to be K through 12 education.
Right.
Why is that no longer the case?
Well, I have to say, first of all, things that are under the control of schools, like tracking, for example, have contributed almost nothing to the growth of this gap. This is not a problem that the schools caused in America. And I say that because we have a tendency in America to blame everything on the schools. If only the schools were doing a better job, we wouldn't have this problem. The schools didn't cause this problem. That's not to say that schools couldn't help fix the problem. But the reason that the problem in schools is getting worse is primarily because the most important thing about the school you go to is who else is going there. If you go to school and there are other kids from affluent, well-educated backgrounds there, you're going to be better off no matter what your background is. And if you go to a school that draws on low-income students, you're going to be worse off no matter what your family income. And if you put that fact, which has been established in the sociological education literature for a long time, together with the fact that we're increasingly segregated by class so that we've got rich folks, it's more and more likely now that rich kids are going to school with other rich kids and poor kids are going to school with other poor kids. There are things we need to do to fix that, but it wasn't, things we need to do in schools to fix that, but it wasn't the schools that caused that problem. Is that making sense? We caused that problem.
Last week I spent most of the week out in California, spent time at Khan Academy, where Sal Khan is using the internet and digital learning to try to get a world-class education for every kid. He also started something that I saw called Khan Academy, the lab school, the Khan Lab School, where he's testing out these things. And in the lab school, it was all what you would call rich or very privileged kids. And it stays open until 6 p.m., and it's 11 months a year, and it's 6 days a week, and they have a lot of technology. Do you think that the internet is going and has been helping to close this economic divergence or exacerbate it?
It's making it worse. But not because, I say that not because I'm anti-technology at all. I'm probably as much plugged in as anybody else here. And excuse me while I check my
I watched him check all of his electronic devices earlier.
But because it turns out now, 10, 15 years ago, we talked about the digital divide, meaning then the fear was that rich kids might have more access to the internet than poor kids. But that's not true. That access gap is closed. So just about all the kids we talk to, all across America, not just in Port Clinton, have smartphones of various sorts. But when you watch how kids use technology, rich kids use it, sorry, rich kids, I mean kids that are well educated, use it in ways that are more calculated to help them with make progress in their lives, like the Khan Academy that you're talking about. And poor kids, because they lack the surrounding support of other adults, tend to use it just for entertainment. And I guess the basic point there that I really want to emphasize is all of the evidence that we pull together in this book. In some sense, the bottom line is poor kids coming from the lower third of American society are increasingly isolated from everyone. They're isolated from their parents because their families are unstable. They're isolated from schools. They're isolated from churches because there's a gap there too. They're isolated from community organizations. They're isolated from their neighbors. Mary Sue recently posted on her website, love hurts, trust kills. Think about living in a world in which you could not trust anybody. And the fact that these kids are increasingly isolated from everyone, not only from their own families, but from other people that might have helped once upon a time, means that lots of bad things happen to them. They don't get help in figure out how to use the internet and other technology. Another striking consequence is what we call airbags. All kids get in trouble, right? If your kids have not gotten in trouble, just wait, they will. So all kids get in, rich kids and poor kids and black kids and white kids, and all kids get in trouble. But when one of our kids, I mean by that, kids from educated backgrounds, gets in trouble, instantly airbags inflate to protect the child. So we have a friend of ours, this is a true story, actually all of my stories are true stories, I try not to use the real people's names, but we have some friends. A woman called, a friend of my wife's, called a couple of weeks ago to say, just terrible, she was devastated. One of her grandsons had been picked up out in Colorado, actually. Allegedly, the claim was he was selling drugs, and probably that may very well be true. You can imagine the grandmother, my wife's friend, was devastated, and what's it going to do to the family and all that kind of stuff. And she was worried about her grandson. But then she said, but my granddaughter's flown out there. We've got the best lawyer in town, and we've found the right rehab place back here in Connecticut, and so it'll probably all work out. Airbags, right? You see that? If exactly the same thing had happened to a black kid on the Lower East Side on the South Side, of Chicago, no airbags. Or if the same thing had happened to Mary Sue, no airbags. And so it's relevant to the degree to which the internet can be helpful. It's relevant to these lives of these kids. They don't have anybody coaching them. They don't have their parents coaching them. They don't have the coaches coaching them because they're dropping out of extracurriculars. Of course, there are big causes as to why that's happened. The growing income gap in America and the social segregation and so on. But when you get down to the kid, when you think poor kid, think isolated kid. Mm-hmm. And then think, it's tough to grow up isolated.
So it gets back to your social capital
and
bowling alone, where there's not quite as many mentors, pastors, preachers, or community leaders saving these kids.
Right. I don't want to kind of come across silly as saying if only we could get all these kids in football, that would solve the problem. But I'm trying to use practical examples to indicate ways in which we used to take care of everybody's kid.
There used to be a coach. There used to be an after-school program. There used to be, shop even in the afternoon.
Right.
And one of the things where you sort of see this, even not just an airbag, but little things that I've noticed with the kids from New Orleans who, after the hurricane, we got to... If you don't have a credit card, you can't really get a cell phone that easily. If you don't have a cell phone, you can't be connected to people that easily. You also can't have a plan that allows you data so that you can pick up your iPhone and find out, who King Canute was or whatever.
Absolutely right.
So how does that play in?
You can see it. Another one of the kids from Port Clinton, poor kids from Port Clinton that we talked to is a guy in the book he's called David. David, as another kid, has just had a horrible life. We recently were trying to get in touch with David again, and can't get in touch with him because his iPhone has been, his phone has been shut off because he can't afford it. Mm-hmm. So, but I think, I don't want to come to the conclusion here that, America's going to hell in a handbasket and we can't do anything about it. There have been previous periods in our history when America has faced problems like this. The best example is the Gilded Age, at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, when we faced a problem very much like this. And I don't want to go off and give a lecture now on the progressive era, but there are a lot of deep parallels between that period and this period.
If you read Doris Kearns Goodwin, The Bully Pulpit, you see that what Teddy Roosevelt does with almost the exact same situation, the scissors, the widening gap, etc., is he says, okay, we're going to have a square deal, which is basically every kid has a decent opportunity.
That's right. And the other really interesting thing about that period, it is, I think Doris and I talked about going on the road together because she's got the solution to my problem, or her period had the solution to my period. The thing to notice about the progressive era is that there was a lot of national discussion at that time about these challenges. That's what Teddy Roosevelt especially was doing, but a lot of other people too, at the national level. Pardon me, but most of the actual policy innovations that came to fix that problem did not come from Washington. That national conversation gave oxygen to local reformers in places all around America. And so the innovations in that time came from, Galveston and Toledo and the Wyoming territories and Iowa, Kansas. The American high school, God did not invent American high schools. High schools were invented by small towns in Iowa and Kansas and the Midwest in this period so that kids, with the idea that these are all our kids, we're all going to be better off if we give all of them a secondary education, free secondary education. That turned out, and then the idea spread across America, that turned out to be the best public policy decision America has ever taken. Because that massive investment in giving a free a high school education to everybody in America, it raised the level of what economists call human capital in America, and accounts for almost all of our growth in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it leveled the playing field because everybody got the. Now, it might have been a little bit of a hard sell to say to the rich farmer or banker or lawyer in town, your kids are already off to Chicago, but you should pay so that these other poor kids in town get a free secondary education. But that's effectively what happened. And it happened, I think, because it happened in the places in which people did think of everybody's kid as they're all our kids. We're all going to be better off, and that's true today. This is not altruism. The whole country would be better off economically, politically, socially, morally, if we could begin to invest more in these kids.
Let's start with economically. What would it do to our economy?
Well, you can phrase it positively or negatively. The best cost estimates are that it cuts, not investing in poor kids costs us about 4% of GDP a year. A big chunk of that is, you might think, the criminal justice system. If we don't invest in poor kids, that's going to raise the number of kids that get involved in the criminal justice system. We're going to have to pay for prisons and all that. Actually, that's not the biggest thing. Welfare payments to these kids are that's not a major part of the cost. Bigger are the health of these kids because they're much less healthy, and poor kids are now much more obese than rich kids, and they're getting more obese faster, so they're going to get more diabetes, and they're going to get sicker longer, and somebody's going to have to pay for that, right? And that turns out to cut probably a percent and a half out of our GDP each year. That just the health of these poor kids. But the other really important part of it is the lost opportunity, the workforce side of this. We're writing off 23 million potential workers every year. Mary Sue is not in a position to be a productive worker, and that means they're not, through no fault of her own, she's not going to be contributing to the if you have a very simple-minded maker-taker view of the world, you say, well, she's going to be a taker. But Mary Sue's not responsible for that. Maybe her parents screwed up, but Mary Sue didn't. And this is the most important point I want to say. Helping Mary Sue won't hurt my Miriam, my own granddaughter. It'll help my granddaughter. My granddaughter will be better off. I don't just mean morally, I mean economically, materially better off if we also invest in other people's kids. This is not a zero-sum game. It's a positive-sum game.
And you said 4% or something, but what's that, 500 billion a year or something?
Yeah, over the life, it's like over the lifetimes of these kids, the best estimate is $5 trillion. So we're talking, a trillion here, a trillion there.
And you also gave a comparison, yeah, adds up, as Dorson said. You also gave a comparison, which I'd love you to try to spin out, because I'm not sure I can remember it exactly, that if Atlanta had the same sort of equality of opportunity that Salt Lake City had, the economy of Atlanta would be what?
11% bigger.
And that's just an economic fact, right?
Yeah, this comes from the Federal Reserve Board in Boston, the economists of the Federal Reserve Board. They've calculated the growth rate of different parts of America. There are other things that affect the growth rate, of course, of given metropolitan areas, but holding all those other things constant, and then you can ask, well, okay, why is Atlanta so low and why is Salt Lake City so high? And that's another discussion, but the fact of the matter is, that makes a big difference. Everybody in Atlanta would be better. Everybody would be better off if they just paid a little more attention to the poor kids.
All right, so you said economically, politically, and morally. Yeah. We've done economically, politically. Isn't there a disfranchisement, that gap too?
Yeah, it's partly disenfranchisement because these poor kids, as you would guess, they are completely disconnected from politics. They have really kind of, frankly, bizarre views about politics because they're just so completely... Think of these poor kids as basically having been unplugged from all of the networks of information and discussion and so on that we know about. And so they think of the political sphere as malevolent. Well, it sort of is from their point of view. But in a way, the first order worry you'd have about that, peasants with pitchforks marching on the gated communities, that's not likely to happen because these kids, they're not likely to... They don't have the organizational skills necessary to get the pitchforks and march on the... it'd be tempting for me to say to rich folks, better be careful. If you don't help these poor kids, they're going to march on your, on your estates. And I don't want to... If you go back to the people who reflected on where fascism came from in the 1930s, what the academic reflections, in retrospect, on that period... say is that the people who were fodder for extremism under extreme international and economic duress were the people who were disconnected. I'm talking about the people in Germany and in Italy and elsewhere. And so it isn't, even though normally the political apathy of these poor kids keeps them from being a threat to democracy. I mean, except if you care about equality. It's not so great for the equality of America that these kids are not going to... Remember, this is the lower third of America that's not taking part in our political system. But it's a little risky to have that many people in the society who actually don't even think of themselves as a member of the society.
But the more compelling argument, perhaps, and the economic or even political one, is the basic moral one and the moral creed of what America stands for.
I sometimes get accused. I'm a Jew. I was converted from Methodism a long time ago, but I sometimes get accused of being an evangelical, which is, in some respects, I appreciate the attack. I think it's just wrong. It just isn't right that Miriam is my granddaughter. She's working really hard. She made one really good decision in her life, my Miriam. She chose well-educated parents.
Mm-hmm. And grandparents, yeah.
And great grandparents. She chose wonderful grandparents. And Mary Sue made only one mistake. She chose the wrong parents. And that's fundamentally wrong, morally wrong.
It's not what America stands for.
No, it isn't.
Somebody noted you have all these, descriptions of issues, but you don't offer enough solutions.
Right.
This is somebody who obviously did not get to the last 2 chapters of your book,
Right.
one of which is called What Can Be Done. So tell us what can be done.
Well, there's some big things that can be done, big hard things that can be done that would have a big effect, but it's going to be a heavy lift. I mean, for example, the best single thing we could do is to end this 30-year stagnation of real wages for men, less educated men. That would have a powerful effect on the family structure and on the lives of these kids. And you know that how to get the American economy working for working class Americans is a matter of a lot of political debate. I don't know that I have anything much to add to that, except it would be a big deal for these poor kids. There are other big things that would be maybe not quite as heavy lift as that, like universal early childhood education. We know, I'll repeat this, we know that early childhood education, high quality, expensive early childhood education has a very high payback rate. And if people here in the room there's a debate about that, but actually most of the debate is pretty ill-informed, and if you look really at the data, that's just true.
So the return on investment is what percent?
Oh, it's about 10 or 11, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11%. It's better than what I'm getting for my retirement accounts. I don't know about you.
Treasury bills, yeah.
So that works. It works especially there's a debate about whether Head Start works or not. I'm trying to summarize very quickly, and it turns out the right answer is cheap Head Start doesn't work, but expensive Head Start does work, and it works so well that you can get your money back. But don't think you can buy that on the cheap if it's just high quality, basically highfalutin daycare or babysitting. Then it doesn't have the effect. But a serious early childhood education makes a difference. And that is not yet entirely politicized. We're in this terribly politically polarized world. That's a shock, I know, to people in this city. But the most comprehensive early childhood education program in America is in Oklahoma, which is a deep red state. So that's something we could do. There are smaller things that we could do, like mentoring for kids, and I don't mean drop-by mentoring. The crucial thing about mentoring, and you know this from your own experience, Walter, is not having lunch once a year with the child and saying, how are things going? You've got to be in their lives, supporting them, providing them with helping to provide them with these airbags and so on, which I know you're doing, and that could make a big difference, and that's something any one of us could do. Frankly, as I say in the book, the fact that school boards, without even thinking about the consequences, have instituted pay-to-play for what was once everybody in America thought it was a part of what you got when you got a public secondary education, that you also got these soft skills from football and band and chorus and so on. Go to your school board and ask them, do you have pay-to-play? And if they say yes, but of course we've got waivers, then tell them that the evidence shows waivers are not worth the paper they're written on, because kids know about who's got a waiver, and the stigma attached to getting a waiver means doesn't work. So, and then while you're there, ask the school superintendent what else you could do to help kids in that school. So there are a lot of range of things, from big things that will require mobilization of the country to small things that will
and
also
you talked about high school becoming universal and free when we went from the agriculture to the industrial age and went through the problems of the progressive era, scissors. Now making community college, trade school, and early college universal and free? Yeah,
yes, that's right. And then I do talk quite a bit about that part of the education system. And it's great that the president has called attention to that and other local governments around the country have called attention to that by saying, let's make community college free. That's great, but actually the evidence shows it's not so much the dollar cost of the community college. It's that I talked about these kids not having airbags. They also don't have any adults who can kind of help them guide them through the complicated process of figuring out what school they should go to and so on. These kids lack savvy. And the thing that's most important is that in cutting back funding for community colleges, for example, across the country, those cuts have come disproportionately on the advising, counseling, and supporting these kids. And that's the worst thing to cut, because that's what makes the dropout rate of community colleges very high. The dropout rate for community colleges is very high, but not for financial reasons, but because these kids don't have somebody there saying, have you thought about taking that course next term and this course this term?
We were in St. Louis earlier last week with Kiana Cassells and Charlie Firestone of the Aspen Institute. We're doing a dialogue with some of the students in Ferguson and St. Louis on race. And among the things that came out of it was both the students in the high school and the former superintendent of the high school saying, it's not only making community college free, it should be seamless, which is you don't sit there worrying about getting from 8th grade to 9th grade. I mean, there may be a little bit of rigmarole you have to go through.
Right.
It should be a seamless process of going from senior year into the proper community college, trade school, whatever it may be.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm. The other things you've talked about, it would be simple enough to have the vision, if not the execution, of every kid having a mentor, every kid having an after-school program, every kid having a good summer opportunity, every kid having early childhood, every kid having post-secondary education. Those are not complicated things. They are really questions of political will, which leads to my last question before we open it up. You made a joke that wasn't funny nor a joke, that we're a partisan city right now. You've been extraordinarily nonpartisan, if I remember. It was George W. Bush you were involved with, John Bridgeland, who works with us on the Franklin Project, you've been close to and been helping us there. You advised Paul Ryan when he came out with his economic opportunity plan. I think Jeb Bush, as well as President Clinton, brought you to Camp David, and Barack Obama gave you the National Medal of something or other, right? Which one was it?
It was National Humanities Medal, and but the more relevant thing is, I as long as we're dropping names, I spent 2 hours talking to the president and the cabinet about this issue.
Right, and the Roosevelt Room, I remember there was Gene Sperling and others pulled it together. So how do we make this the moral and economic issue of 2016 and not make it part of a partisan divide?
Well, that's the $64,000 question from my point of view. I do think, just to recapitulate what you said, there are some tough questions about exactly how you design the right programs to fix the problem. But this is not a case where we don't have any good policy ideas. This is a case where, as you said, we don't have the political will. And we don't have the political will fundamentally, I think, because we've moved ourselves as a country into a situation where we don't think of these as our kids. We think of them as somebody else's kid. If you go to Port Clinton High School now, in the parking lot, you can see parked right next door to each other BMW convertibles, driven there by kids whose parents live on the lake, and junkers, we would have called them in my day, in which the kids live. And the parents of the one don't think of the other kids as one of our kids. That's why I called the book Our Kids, because I think that's the crucial step we've got to get over. It's true that political figures on both sides of the aisle, I think correctly, see this as a major issue. It's been part of my goal to make this problem of the opportunity gap the central domestic issue in the 2016 elections. I want to have this be the litmus test. If you're a serious candidate for President of the United States, what is your solution to the problem of the opportunity gap? That's my aspiration. And I think we're making some progress there. As you say, a number of candidates on both sides have begun to talk about the opportunity gap. And they won't agree, of course. That's fine. That's the way democracy works. If we all agree that we've got a problem here, then we can talk about how to fix the problem. I do worry, though, that this will turn into a search for villains, and the political magnetic field here will be so strong that this whole issue will get pulled into, it's all about fixing the economy, or it's all about fixing the families, or is it really cultural or really structural, that whole thing, and that we'll lose sight of the kids. And I want to focus on the kids. The
best way to make that happen in 2016 is to make sure everybody reads your book. So let me, with that note, open it up. Yes, ma'am. You can shout, and I'll repeat, and the microphone will get to you. Yes.
I've read some research that says the most important determinant of success, I'll speak without the mic, is not money, is not education, is motivation. So I've seen poor kids that have been highly motivated to succeed and have worked very hard and have succeeded.
Right.
And I've seen some rich kids that have not been very motivated despite their education and have not done well. So could you speak to that issue, please?
Sure, that's no doubt true that motivation makes a difference, but we shouldn't assume that motivation is coming from genes or God. That is, that it's somehow from outside the kid, or maybe the kid just woke up that morning and decided not to be. That's what we know about motivation, actually, is that it comes from having success sequences early in life. And so Mary Sue is this young woman in Port Clinton that I'm talking about. She's less motivated than my granddaughter Miriam, who's also a granddaughter of Port Clinton. Miriam is, her parents are college educated, and she's going off to France this summer, and she's motivated to become a really good French cultural, historian or whatever she's going to be. God knows what she's going to be. She's highly motivated. Mary Sue is just trying to find somebody who will love her. And you could say, well, Mary Sue doesn't have very high motivation, but that comes out of her experience. That comes out of Mary Sue's experience. So I don't want to let either her parents or the rest of us off the hook by saying, well, if the kid just, I know this is not what you're saying, but I want to be careful. In focusing on motivation, we say, well, if you just pulled yourself up out of your bootstraps, kiddo, you'd be just fine. I had a little bit that feeling myself before I did this research. I'd come from a modest background. I've done okay in life. I thought, well, if I can do it, why can't kids now do it? Pulling myself up by my bootstraps. But that, I now see that was someplace between nuts and evil for me to think that.
And it's become harder to pull yourself up by your bootstraps in the past 60 years.
Yeah,
is that right?
It has. And it has become harder. And it's become harder in the following way. We have, in a way, privatized most, I don't mean this in a necessarily political sense, but we used to pay attention to all of our kids, and therefore, we had playgrounds and little leagues and so on. But that has all gradually been privatized, which if you're, my grandchildren, that's great. They can have wonderful soccer teams. They learn stick-to-itiveness and grit and all that kind of stuff. Mary Sue's not learning, and none of the, actually, it was quite striking. We interviewed kids, hundreds of kids, all across America, from Orange County to Atlanta to Bend, Oregon to the Boston area, and almost none of them had any activities at all, except watching TV. And
so they don't learn the grit and the persistence. And you said somewhere between nuts and evil. I mean, that's a strong statement. We have to show that just saying this, as Chelsea's mother does in your book, it has really pernicious consequences, right?
Oh, yeah. It's just, I mean, our kids, now our own biological kids, are doing well, and that's great, and we're doing all we can to help them. And that's great. I'm not saying that's anything evil about that. And and if they lack a little motivation, we try to help them around that. I'm not saying that's evil, but if you then think about, I'm not talking just to you personally, of course, I'm talking to everybody, but if we actually thought of Mary Sue as one of our kids, if I actually thought of Mary Sue as one of my kids, I couldn't sleep at night until I figured out a way to help her. And the way I'm trying to do it is to try to get all of you to see, we all have got a stake in Mary Sue.
All right, I'm sorry, we should, we got so many hands, yes, and then Alma, because that's her book series. Hi, if you help us with the book series, you get jumped ahead of the queue.
Ilya Zirk with the National Conference on Citizenship. Very nice to see you, Bob. Partially as a result of Bowling Alone, we now have data that measures volunteering and civic life in America. And that data shows a very strong correlation between education and civic engagement.
Sure.
I wonder, and I know that we don't have the same data sets from the 50s, but I wonder if that was different back then, and if so, why, and what that means for our future.
Well, thank you very much for the question. The underlying observation here is that people who have more education are generally more likely to take part in civic activity. It wasn't quite as true it was always a little bit true, but it wasn't quite as true in that earlier period because there were other institutions that mobilized people to take part in politics. Political parties mobilized people to take part in politics, and unions and churches mobilized, and all sorts of organizations. Actually, bizarrely, one of my earliest research papers, this is back in the 60s when I was an infant, was on the importance of those organizations in mobilizing political support. I don't mean, yeah, I guess that's the way I'd leave it. And we don't have that now. And if you think political parties are trying to do this, you don't really completely, I don't mean you do, but political parties spend as much time trying to figure out how to depress participation among their opponents than they do how to increase participation among their own advocates. Yes, ma'am.
Alma Gildenhorn.
Thank you very much for being here today. It's just been wonderful. Between Mary Sue and Miriam, in the middle of that scissors, there's a whole group, a vast group of people, of young people,
right,
who are not college material. What has happened to the trade schools? Today at my house I had the telephone man, the washing machine man, the refrigerator man. I cannot begin to tell you of all the trades people that come to my house.
right.
So these are perfectly capable people. What happened to the trade schools?
First of all, can I get the name of your plumber, please?
Sure.
No, I'm agreeing with you, of course. Well, you're right. That is a big gap in our array of opportunities we provide kids. There was, for a number of years, a mantra that was called College for All, and basically all kids in America now have believed that. They all believe that they need to get college. Even poor kids believe that they need to get college. But it had the perhaps unfortunate side effect of defining what they needed in terms that were too narrowly focused on a particular kind of secondary education, post-secondary education, and not, for example, on apprenticeships and other kinds of serious education, but education aimed not at liberal arts education, but aimed at a real job, fixing things or making things. And so, right, there's some good models. In the book, I talk about a number of models around the country of programs aimed exactly as you're suggesting at that group of kids.
Let me try to get some others in, and then we can. Okay, go ahead. But really, there are a lot of other people, Alma, who want to say something.
When I was growing up, there were no outreach programs. No outreach programs. Today, every organization that I belong to has an outreach program. So I do think that there is civic engagement. You name a university, the Aspen Institute, the Portrait Gallery, everyone has an outreach program. So why do you say there is no civic engagement?
Well, I don't want to be bad-mouthing outreach programs, but we used to do it without calling it that. That is, all of us used to be doing outreach, and most of us are no longer doing outreach. I don't mean formal outreach. I mean the little old lady with her fur coat and her fur hat in Port Clinton who took my black classmate down to the high school and pounded on the desk and said, "This woman deserves an education." She would have. The mind boggles. She would never have said, "I'm doing outreach here." She was just helping one of the kids in town. And so I'm not at all being dismissive of outreach, but in a way, that's a kind of a more formalized way of trying to make up for the fact that we used to do this a ton more just in our lives, and we don't anymore.
Yes, ma'am, right there on the aisle. Sorry.
Thank you. Could you talk a bit about the role, not of external organizations like mentors and so on and so forth,
Right.
but actually families and working with families on family engagement,
Yeah,
like
sure.
nurse-family partnership, or
Yeah,
other
yeah.
evidence-based practices.
Right.
And why don't you hand the microphone to the person next to you, if you would, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That was just, I shouldn't have omitted that. I agree very much that coaching, parental coaching programs and home visiting programs, of which the nurse family partnership is the most well-tested of those, but there are others too. There are some proven examples. You've named NFP, and that's one of them. And those are good and needed. And indeed, one of the distinctions between, there's this debate, sort of slightly wonkish debate in this city and elsewhere about does Head Start work or not work, and an important part of the answer is it works much better if it's combined with outreach to the parents and coaching of the parents through programs of the sort you're describing. Thank you for reminding me that I omitted that in my list of fixes earlier.
I was wondering in your research if you found anything that's unique to the immigrant community or the
Yeah.
immigrant experience and their sense of how they help each other out.
Yeah.
And why don't you pass the microphone to the gentleman right there in front of you, yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, first-generation immigrants controlling for where they are economically have a much more stable, structured family relationship, and that's part of the stereotype that we all have, and it's basically sort of true. That's the good news. And the bad, and it varies from ethnic group to ethnic group. I'm not going to go into all the great detail, but in general, immigrant groups look a little more like traditional American families. Ozzie and Harriet, and they're both worrying about the kids. That's the good news. The bad news is that more or less vanishes after one generation. So assimilation occurs in many good ways. In a different life, I'm a big advocate of immigration, and I've talked a lot about that publicly, and I still am. And I like the idea of assimilation. People, are becoming a richer mixture, our country. But this is one area in which probably assimilation is not such a great thing, that the immigrant families then become, in the second generation, more like the rest of us. Yeah.
In the way back?
I can yell. So I'm curious about the role of technology. You sort of talked about the Khan Academy as being a separate platform and the access gap shortening, where younger, less educated, lower income people are using more social platforms than maybe some of these education, human capital building platforms. Are you engaging, or can you talk about more of the bright spots or trend lines where can you talk more about bright spots or trend lines where something like Facebook, like I know they've increased the number of people going out to vote, or they're trying to get more people to register as organ donors. Can you talk about some of the social technology companies bringing in ways to close some of these scissor issues?
Well, maybe you're more aware of those than I am, actually. I'm aware, I know, of course, about a lot of the ways in which social media are changing our lives, because, just before the explosion of social websites and social media and so on occurred just after I wrote the book Bowling Alone. So by far the single most often question I'm asked when talking about Bowling Alone is, yeah, but how about the internet? So I've thought a lot about how the internet does and doesn't make up for the disappearance of bowling leagues. And there are many ways in which it does more than make up for the disappearance of bowling leagues. But now I'm focused not on is the internet good or bad for building productive social relations, but is it narrowing the gap? And frankly, I do not know, you'll tell me, but I do not know of any website or any major app that is specifically devoted to narrowing the gap. And the reason I think that's important is often tacitly in the background, even of Facebook, is a web of relationships. So I've got friends on Facebook, a few of whom actually I've never met, but most of whom I know in real life. And so my relationship via Facebook is a kind of an alloy combined of the real face-to-face connections and the internet-based connections. These poor kids are so isolated from any real-world face-to-face connections that's I think the challenge. I don't think that a purely virtual app is going to solve the real problems that these kids had. But the more creative question, which I do not know that anybody's asked, is are there ways in which we can create a new kind of alloy that is directed specifically to Mary Sue? Is that making sense?
And Mary Sue is on Facebook.
Yeah, she is, but
Therefore, you could try to figure out, okay, how do we build on that to make a alloy that includes real-life support?
yeah.
This gentleman here, then I'll come back. Oh, yeah, you have it, sorry. This gentleman, then yourself, yeah.
Hi, you talked about the scissor graphs that show the divergence of the bottom third and the top third, which I think we're all aware of. More recently, there's been a lot of attention from Thomas Piketty and others about a scissor that's developing between the 80% and the 20%. That there are people who do go to community college, they even get four-year degrees, and are still not improving their economic standing. And they're seeing a bigger gap, separating them from the well-off. And I wonder, if you've looked at this, and also one of the reasons that this is happening is that as robotics and computer technology advance, more of these relatively highly skilled jobs are being done by machines, and that trend is likely to accelerate in the future. So when you look at that, what prospects does that offer for people who are trying to make it and really improve their relative standing?
Right. From my point of view, and you'll correct me if I'm misunderstanding your question, you're talking about the demand side of the labor market. That is, how is demand shifting at various levels in the educational or income hierarchy? And you probably know about the famous hourglass economy hypothesis. That is, that the demand is growing way up at the top, and then among pretty simple manual jobs that can't easily be outsourced, and the demand is narrowing in the middle. That's what economists describe. My book is actually not focused so much on the demand side for labor. It's much more focused on the supply side. What skills do various kids coming at various points from the hierarchy have? And there, I have to say, it is the major cleavage is the one that I've described. That is, it's between kids who are coming from relatively well-educated homes, that is, college-educated homes, and those who are coming from high school-educated homes. In the middle of those two are the people who are coming from, some college. Of course, we've got to worry about the economics of the demand side of the problem too. But even if we solve that problem, we still would have the supply side, and that's what I'm focused on here. What skills and resources or deficits are we endowing all of our kids with? That's what I've been focused on.
Unfortunately, I'm going to make this the last question, but then we will have time for everybody to just cluster around you, get books signed, and ask more questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Putnam, for opening up what I think is a very critical topic here. But I find that there's a real political disconnect. We talked about a culture of life during the Bush administration. And it seems to me in these political times that life seems to end at birth for a lot of people. That, we don't want to give them birth control, we don't want to have them have abortions, but when they come into the world, we don't want to feed them, we don't want to clothe them, we don't want to give them proper health care. My son's a 5th grade teacher, and he says, he's got a high minority population. And he says, Dad, it's hard to teach these kids when they come to school hungry. So there's such a great disadvantage here. I'm absolutely grateful that you've opened this up, because I think at your level, maybe we will get some intellectual capital going here. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And you may use that as your closing platform.
I'm very grateful to all of you who are here. I hope that if we can get some agreement, this is a big problem facing America. I think it's a terrifically big problem, but it's also a terrifically big opportunity. If we can begin to fix this, we can actually make America a more productive, more democratic, better place to live. So, and ideas about how to fix it are really important. But the most thing is you've got to convince your neighbors and your elected officials and so on. This is a unique opportunity or problem. Thank you very much.
Professor Robert Putnam, thank you very much.